So hopefully I convinced you in the last video that all that detail with alpha, beta, norepinephrine, epinephrine, sympathetic, parasympathetic, it matters a lot because a lot of drugs have been designed based off of that physiology. But now let's look at some other clinical cases related to blood pressure regulation. And some that you would not expect were related to blood pressure issues. Let's look at the first one. This little girl is experiencing starvation. You can see in her arms emaciation, so complete loss of fat tissue, of muscle tissue. You can see her arms. She literally looks like skin and bones. But then when you look at the abdomen, it almost seems like the opposite scenario, where it seems swollen and maybe actually like there is fat tissue there. So what explains the fact that she looks so thin everywhere except the abdomen? Would you believe that it's a blood pressure issue? We're going to explain that in the video. A second blood pressure issue, which we might not have expected, presents itself when somebody has a heart issue. So for example, if their left ventricle fails and they can no longer pump blood out of their left ventricle, one way to diagnose that that's happening is this person finds it hard to breathe as effectively. They feel short on breath. You can actually measure the oxygen saturation in their blood and it's lower. Would you believe that this is a blood pressure issue? He finds it hard to breathe after his heart failure because of a change in blood pressure. Weird. So in previous videos, we've seen that blood pressure can affect whether you feel dizzy or not, or it can affect whether your blood vessels rupture or get damaged. But how can changes in blood pressure lead to an abdomen that's swollen, even in a patient that is starving? And how can changes in blood pressure lead to respiratory issues in a patient with cardiac failure? So how can these both be blood pressure related? So let's quickly review why blood pressure matters and how we exchange nutrients between our blood and our tissues. So just as a reminder, blood is always flowing from high pressure to lower pressure. So maintaining this pressure gradient is absolutely critical. But one of the main reasons we want blood to flow from the arteries to the arterioles and eventually to the capillaries is because the capillaries are the site at which we can exchange fluids, glucose, ions, oxygen, carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissues. They are the only place in the entire cardiovascular system where stuff can come into and out of the blood. So capillaries are the only sites of gas exchange, nutrient exchange, and waste exchange. And you guys might remember from anatomy that they're specially designed to allow that to happen. Once blood flows into a capillary because of that pressure gradient, capillaries are designed to be extremely thin to facilitate transport of things like gases. They even have junctions to allow small particles and water to dissolve. They have a method to transport things across the blood vessel. Only in capillaries do you have this ability. So blood pressure matters in part because that high to low pressure is what drives blood or fluid to the capillaries. But what I wanted to introduce real quick And what's going to help us understand those two patient cases at the beginning of this video is we're no longer going to say blood pressure generally. We're no longer use that term blood pressure. We're going to try to separate it into two different kinds of blood pressure. So the first kind, known as hydrostatic pressure, is basically the way we've been talking about it so far. Because in previous videos, I've talked about blood pressure like being what we have this fluid inside the blood vessel, and it's applying pressure to the walls of the vessel. So that's like this water balloon where we have water, which is like blood, applying pressure to the walls of this balloon, which is like our blood vessel. But instead of saying that this is blood pressure, we're now going to give it a specific name. This pressure, due to fluid pushing against the walls of the container, so the blood vessel, this is known as hydrostatic pressure. Hydro basically referring to its pressure due to a fluid like water or blood. But what's unique about this hydrostatic pressure is that if there's a little hole in the vessel, so in your blood vessel or in the balloon, hydrostatic pressure tends to force fluid out. And that's why some fluid leaves at your capillaries, because we saw that your capillaries have basically holes. So hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries will force fluid, at least some fluid, to start leaving the blood vessel. So that's one pressure, hydrostatic pressure, which basically drives fluid out of your capillaries. A second type of fluid pressure, though, is one we saw way back in like week 1 or 2, known as osmotic pressure. And this is the fluid pressure which is driven by osmolarity. As you guys remember, fluid always flows towards a higher osmolarity, and that's why in this picture, the fluid starts going to the right side of this beaker. But usually the osmolarity inside your blood vessels is higher, so osmotic pressure tends to pull fluid back into your capillaries. So we have these two pressures, hydrostatic pressure that tends to force fluid out of your capillaries, and osmotic pressure that tries to pull it back in using the osmolarity inside the blood vessel. So here's how these two pressures affect how much fluid you keep in your blood vessels and how much of it gets pushed out. So let's say blood starts flowing in. So there's tons of fluid here coming into the capillary, shown right here. We know that as all this fluid gets forced into this more narrow capillary, the hydrostatic pressure is going to be really great because there's so much fluid coming in. And so on this side, what's going to happen, due to hydrostatic pressure, a lot of fluid is going to be filtered out of the blood. It's going to leave the blood vessel. So effectively what's happening here is this. All this blood is coming into the capillary, and some of it is going to be forced out due to that hydrostatic pressure. But if the fluid stays out here, if it stays in your interstitial space, if it stays in your tissue is going to start to swell up. It's going to get bigger with fluid. But normally that does not happen because on the other side of the capillary, we reabsorb a lot of that fluid due to osmotic pressure. So the osmolarity of the blood vessel will pull the water back in. So on this side, what's happening is this. The inside of the blood vessels pulling water back in, taking it out of the tissue and putting it back into the blood vessel. So normally, if you look at your fingers, if you look at your biceps, if you look at your knee, hopefully it should not be swollen. And that's because this fluid that's filtered out on this side gets reabsorbed on that side. Hydrostatic pressure pushes it out. Osmotic pressure pulls it back in. And by the way, your lymphatic system will also help you absorb some of that water, preventing it from collecting in the tissues. But let's just focus on hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. So shown another way, here's basically what happens. As the blood enters the capillary, hydrostatic pressure, let's say, is 35. Osmotic pressure is only 25. So fluid gets forced out. But as the blood continues to travel, hydrostatic pressure is falling as we lose some of that fluid, and as that fluid starts slowing down because it's kind of running into the walls of the vessel. But as we get to the other side of the capillary, now osmotic pressure, which hasn't really changed at all from the beginning, is now greater than the hydrostatic pressure. And so the fluid gets reabsorbed back in. So effectively what happens is you lose fluid on this side of the capillary, but then you gain much of it back on the other side of the capillary. That prevents fluid from building up in your tissues. So this is normal. This is a healthy tissue where fluid is not collecting. If fluid leaves or is filtered out, it is reabsorbed back into the capillary. But let's look at her case, Fatima's case, and explain why she has a swollen abdomen, even though she looks completely starved. Well, if you're starving, that means that you don't have a lot of nutrients, specifically in the blood vessels near your intestine where you absorb a lot of those nutrients. And so in the plasma, in these blood vessels, there is not much protein. So the osmolarity of her plasma is very low. So what ends up happening for her is blood gets filtered out due to hydrostatic pressure, so that happens. But because she doesn't have much protein in these blood vessels, because the osmolarity in this blood vessel is so much lower than normal, the osmotic pressure is low, which means she's not going to be able to reabsorb as much fluid as she normally would have. So the fluid starts collecting in the tissue. It's filtered out by hydrostatic pressure, but it cannot be reabsorbed as well by osmotic pressure. And so all of this right here, that's not fat accumulating. That's tissue being swollen by fluid collecting in the tissue, leaving the blood and staying in the abdominal tissue. So this is an osmotic pressure problem. Hydrostatic pressure is now much greater than what osmotic pressure can do. In class, we're going to use hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure to explain Jose's case, where his left ventricle has failed, and for some reason, that made it hard for him to breathe. But if you want a clue, and here's a clue, try thinking about if your left ventricle fails and it can no longer pump blood out into the aorta, where would the blood go if the left ventricle stopped working? Where would blood back up into if your left ventricle failed? In class on Monday, we'll answer those questions and explain exactly why this poor guy finds it hard to breathe because his heart failed. And so to me, this is another case where physiology is not only incredibly interesting, because you guys know that I think it is, but it's incredibly important. Because all this stuff with osmotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure, it explains this very important clinical case where your left ventricle can fail and that can affect your respiratory system. In class, we'll also talk about what happens if your right ventricle fails and the different kind of clinical symptoms that person would experience.